Good afternoon. My name is Bill Summers. I'm a member of the Dwight H. Terry Lectureship Committee, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you and introduce today's Terry Lecture, Professor Janet Browne of Harvard University. The Terry Lectures invite preeminent scholars in religion, the sciences, and philosophy to address issues concerning the ways in which science and philosophy inform religion and religion's application to human welfare. This lectureship was established in 1905 by a gift from Dwight Harrington Terry of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and is among Yale's most distinguished lectureships. It has yielded important and enduring books published by Yale University Press. Mr. Terry's deed of gift states that, quote, a series of lectures be given on ethics, the history of civilization and religion, biblical research, all sciences and branches of knowledge which have an important bearing on the subject, and the great laws of nature, especially evolution. This year's Terry Lecture, Professor Janet Browne, the Aramont Professor of History of Science at Harvard, admirably suits Mr. Terry's intentions, as she is one of the world's leading scholars on the life, times, and impact of Charles Darwin, a compelling historical figure who exerts a continuing influence on our time. Janet's interests range widely over a history of life sciences and the natural history. After a degree in zoology from Trinity College Dublin, she turned to history of science and received her PhD from Imperial College London. Her first book, The Secular Ark, presciently published by Yale University Press, traces the history of naturalists interested in the question of how species are distributed around the world. She has also written on the history of museums, specimen collecting, and botanic gardens. Since then, she has specialized in reassessing Charles Darwin's work, first as associate editor of the early volumes of the Correspondence of Charles Darwin, and more recently as author of a major two-volume biographical study that integrates Darwin's science and his life and times. While it was framed as a biographical study, this work explores the ways in which scientific knowledge was created, distributed, and accepted, moving from the private to the public. Widely read by a general audience, Browne's Darwin biographies have been described by various reviewers as magisterial, monumental, dazzling, definitive, brilliant, and a masterpiece. Her work has won several notable literary and scholarly prizes, including the Pfizer Prize from the History of Science Society. She has served as editor of the British Journal for History of Science and was president of the British Society for History of Science. Professor Browne was for many years at University College London before moving to Harvard in 2006. Professor Browne's Terry Lectures are entitled Becoming Darwin, History, Memory, and Biography, and today she will speak on Darwin as an economist of nature. It's with immense pleasure that I present to you my colleague and good friend, Professor Janet Browne.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for those very generous words, and hello. Thank you all for coming. As you can imagine, I'm immensely honored to be invited to give these lectures and to follow in the footsteps of so many distinguished other speakers and thinkers. I wish particularly to thank the Terry Lectureship Committee and their chair, Professor Martin, and my colleagues, Bill Summers, Jean Black, for their very generous hospitality. And I'm awfully glad also to welcome my colleagues and friends from here and other places to hear me today. It's a delight, and thank you very much. So I wanted to start by talking about James Conant, who was a previous speaker in these Terry lectureships quite some time ago, 1946. He was at that time the president of Harvard University, that small town to the north of here. And he had the privilege of delivering the Terry Lectures at Yale. He spoke about the need to provide a better understanding of science to those people who have no intention of becoming scientists. And he went on at Harvard to promote the teaching of popular science by means of case studies, which we do continue to do, more or less, to the present day. His many other achievements as a transformative post-war president at Harvard included the promotion of co-ed classes and adopting an early version of the tenure system for professors. He also abolished athletic scholarships, presumably not quite realizing the importance of the game for those of us living on the eastern seaboard. And drawing on the lectures he gave here in Yale, he established the History of Science department at Harvard, where I work. So I take special pleasure in acknowledging these interconnections, and I'm very glad to be speaking here at our sister university. Yet Conant's vision of the history of science did not embrace any of the approaches that we now call sociological, political, religious, or cultural. Nor did he express much interest in gender issues, or the media, or any parts of the world beyond Europe or North America. So despite his admirable commitment to explaining science by using history, Conant's approach was light years away from what happens today in the department that he created. And in this series of lectures, I aim to use history of science as it stands today to explore what sort of man the Victorian naturalist Charles Darwin might have been, and to push that story into the 20th and 21st centuries to ask how writers and artists have constructed and reconstructed his personality successively in the years beyond. And this will perhaps be a familiar story to many of you, for which I apologize. His place in history as the celebrated author of On the Origin of Species, of course, is firm. He must be one of the most studied figures in the history of science. And Bill very generously mentioned some of the words that have been used to describe my biography, but he didn't mention big. So there's an awful lot of work on Darwin, which I'm going to be drawing on today. I'm very grateful for this work by other people. And that work now reaches into popular culture very extensively and other disciplines such as art, literature, poetry, and economics. Yet I do think it's a story worth retelling. I've called this series of talks Becoming Darwin because I hope to address the historical processes that have generated the figure of Darwin that we customarily encounter in the media today. The modern Darwin, as might be expected, represents modern issues. He's often represented as an intrepid explorer in contemporary science documentaries. He is plagued by religious doubt in the movies. He's photoshopped into satirical images on the web, and he's often presented as a champion of biodiversity in museums. In some parts of North America, you will know that he's a person who school children are recommended not to believe. Sometimes he appears as a character in a play, sometimes as an artwork, occasionally as a fridge magnet, and frequently as a bumper sticker. He's a part of modern commodity culture, and I just want to show you that there's a mountain named after Darwin. There's many, many variants of food purveyors. This one is in Dublin, not actually when I was a student in Dublin, but it is in Dublin now, without the apostrophe, I'm sure you'll notice. There's a number of other kinds of food stuff. There's quite a strong line of beers produced with Darwin's name in the place where he was born, Shrewsbury, in the United Kingdom. There are movies, which some of you may have seen. This one is the Creation movie, issued in the year that was Darwin's bicentenary, 2009. That is very good in parts. And what I would love, if you're thinking of buying me a Christmas present, there's the Lego Voyage of the Beagle with all Darwin's shipmates as little characters to stick in the ship. And here is Darwin himself, who you'll recognize. And this evening, I want to dwell on an aspect of Darwin's character that opens up what I think is a different way of thinking about the interrelations between his science and his family life. This aspect of his character could be called the accountant's view of nature. I wish to explore this both literally, as seen in Darwin's own family account books, his financial books and his investments, and figuratively, as expressed in metaphors in his theory of evolution by natural selection. And my hope is that we'll come to see that Darwin believed that sound financial management in his home not only contributed to the contemporary ethos of the respectable upper classes of Great Britain, and that he, in this activity, drew very obviously on the prevailing world of Malthusian political economy, but that accountancy was also his way of being a virtuous and moral man. And virtue is a theme that I shall be raising again in following talks. Together we can reflect on the way that Darwin emerged as the most famous natural philosopher of his day, simultaneously praised and reviled for having thrown God out of nature. And we can look together at how he has become an emblem for science, first of all as an icon for secularization, for the secular world, for rationalism, and more recently as a figure who enables people to talk to one another about the fundamental tenets of belief and how they may fit in the modern world, which I take to be part of the brief for the Terry Lectures. So thank you. And first, a little background. So accountants are underestimated people, although their methods, as Ted Porter and other scholars remind us, reflect key features of the scientific method in that they rely on precision, the control of data, and standardization. And my interest in Darwin's accountancy was sparked by a comment made by him in response to a printed questionnaire, which I have here for you, sent to him in 1873 by his cousin, Francis Galton. And in that questionnaire, Darwin was asked to list the mental qualities that he thought contributed to his scientific success. It had been sent out by Francis Galton to all the fellows then of the Royal Society of London, and the returns came to supply the basis of Galton's first hereditarian study called English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture, published in 1874. And as our colleague Dan Kevlis has shown, who Dan's here tonight, this was the period that Galton was developing the idea of eugenics, which he went on to define in 1883. So he was interested in Darwin because of his fame as a scientific thinker, and also because he was his cousin. They were related through their grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the evolutionist, poet, and physician, and Galton felt that he and Darwin most likely shared several scientific characteristics through inheritance. The questionnaire was 7 pages long. I've only given you the top bit here, covering family background, physique, health, mental traits, education, politics, and religious belief. It's actually quite illuminating. And at the end of this questionnaire, Galton asked each man of science if he thought he possessed any special talent. And we might nowadays imagine, expect, Darwin to have said that he was very good at observing, or he was very patient in collecting evidence, or that he had a long-term love for natural history. Those are the kinds of things we might expect. Instead, he answered that he felt he had no special talents, none, except for business, as evinced by keeping accounts, replies to correspondence, and investing money very well. Very methodical in all my habits, he wrote. And it's that Darwin that I want to explore today with you, the methodical man who rated his skill in investing money and keeping accounts higher than any other quality that he might possess. So Darwin kept a series of account books from 1839. I'm sorry about the poor quality of this reproduction. Begun 10 days after his marriage to the morning, and kept to the morning of his death in April 1882. He used the system of double entry bookkeeping that he had learnt from his father, Robert Waring Darwin. And one set of books was concerned with investments. There's the cash book that you have here, and there was a series of ledgers, which I shall show in a moment. Daily transactions were jotted down in the cash book, like this, and he was very careful to date it and to check off on the left-hand side when he had transferred that amount into the ledgers. He even recorded the cash that he took out for himself, as in this check that you can see. We don't get checks sent back to us anymore from our banks when our statements come out every month, but that was the practice usually. But nevertheless, it's quite rare to find a check signed by Darwin drawing on his own account. Something must have gone wrong with the system that it's still in existence today. So that's an unusual item, although it looks terribly mundane. Periodically, the details were entered into ledgers, and this is an annual ledger with credits on one side and debits on the other. Again, I'm afraid it's too small for you to see, but I couldn't get the whole of the book in without making the writing almost indecipherable. This was, the sums were totaled on an annual basis with the expenditure divided into categories, or classed, as Darwin called it. And year by year, he could track expenditure on defined categories of goods and services. And here is one such of those ledgers, the classed accounts. This one shows science on the left, his annual expenditure on science, and his annual expenditure on gardens on the right. And you can see they're nearly, gardens is 2/3 more than science. Here's a, I hope, a slightly enlarged version of that. You can see that on the left, his science accounts for that year really don't run to much. He mentions Sowerby. Oh, where is Sowerby? He's paid Sowerby, who was giving him, who was providing illustrations for his barnacle book. This is Kesson for translations. Here's Insect Britannica, and here's another Kesson translations. Not very much spent on that. And on the gardens, you can perhaps see that there's this Brooks, and Brooks again, Brooks down here again. It's the name of his gardener. That's his salary. And then occasionally we have potatoes. Here's more potatoes. That's seed potatoes. And here are cattle's seeds and plants. So that was May. He was obviously planting for the summer season. Here's a mowing machine. That too is quite unusual for Victorian England. That was towed by a donkey. It wasn't a mechanical machine. So that under this double entry system, the credits and debits should exactly match. They should add up to 0 at the end of each accounting period. And it was a system designed to reveal errors. If you were an actual accountant, it revealed errors or fraud. And we can see Darwin on other pages identifying his small annual errors and correcting his balance sheet. Darwin's investment books naturally excite a great deal of comment. They show that from the middle years of the 1850s, he usually made an income of some £6,000 to £7,000, English pounds, and from that money he invested some £2,000 or £3,000. So they lived on about £3,000 per year, and he invested the balance of his income. His portfolio included what you might expect: government stocks, railway shares, canal and dockyard schemes, plus some farmland in East Anglia that had been bought for him by his father as a rental concern, and several loans in the form of mortgages raised on property carried over from his father's death. Darwin inherited these loans at a very healthy interest rate of more than 3%. It's not easy to work out exactly how much he was worth every year because income tax returns weren't invented. You could count it up from these ledgers, but I haven't done so. But we know that he began married life in January 1839 with a marriage bond given to him by his father of £10,000, £573 in the bank, and £36 in his pocket. That's his total financial income. By 1881, the year before his death, when his banking son William added everything up, they were making his will a little more up to date, that sum had increased to £282,000, excluding the profits from his books. So it was a very healthy sum indeed. And I'd like to correct, just in passing, a common myth that most of Darwin's money came from his marriage to his cousin Emma Wedgwood, shown here. Emma Wedgwood was the granddaughter of Josiah Wedgwood, the entrepreneurial China magnate who permanently altered consumer culture during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. She's seen here in her marriage portrait that was intended to be paired with that of her husband. They're very rarely seen together quite like this as a marriage pair, done by the same artist, George Richardson, but you can see they're not done at the same time. There's nearly a year that was in between these two, so they don't match in any way. The colouring is very different. But Emma Wedgwood certainly brought capital into the marriage. Her marriage bond from her father, who was Darwin's maternal uncle, amounted to £5,000, half of what Darwin's trust fund was. And Charles Darwin, her husband, and two other family members managed this money on Emma's behalf because women were not legally able to own property. The interest on Emma's money was reinvested for her by Darwin. It was not spent, nor was it available to her, so to speak. And on her death, the accumulated capital amounted to some £24,000, which was split between the children as a direct inheritance. So it was her security, really, in case Darwin died whilst she was still alive. So the family, in essence, lived on the interest on capital that came into the marriage in 1840. It was managed entirely by Darwin as the head of a Victorian household, and the English historian Harold Perkins well described this category of the upper middle classes in Britain in the first half of the 19th century, whose assets often originated in manufacture, but were usually converted into paper wealth, as we see exactly here in the Wedgwood family, and the ownership of land, property, and estates over the course of several generations. And the Wedgwood family was one of Perkins's best examples of that process. Now, where am I going with this? These account books reveal something significantly geeky about Darwin, and that's what I want to dwell on. For Darwin, I think this constant attention to financial matters, the regular entering of figures, the adding up of credits and debits, became a way to create rigor and certainty in a ceaseless flow of information and activity. Even when he was on the Beagle voyage, he was very careful to keep his records straight, or as straight as he could. He separated lists of fossils from his lists of plants, or his zoological specimens, or his rocks and minerals. And by middle life, now the time I wish to dwell on, by middle life, when he was working hard on evolutionary theories, long after the Beagle voyage was completed, he seems to have become rather compulsive about lists and records. So you'll know, perhaps, that he kept a daily diary, a journal that he calls, in which he counted the precise days, weeks, and hours that he was able to work each month. This shows the page from his diary in which The Origin of Species was completed. You'll see here that he says that he's finished proofs, and it took him 13 months and 10 days. Just there, 13 months and 10 days. He kept a diary of his poor health, which perhaps wasn't as compulsive a preoccupation as we might think, because this was usually what a physician would ask a patient to do before or after a consultation in the 19th century. He kept a record of the books he had read and was about to read. So here we have 2 pages, 2 ends of the same notebook turned upside down. And these 2 notebooks were very early in his evolutionary thinking. He didn't always cross them off from the books to be read, but here you can see the books read, that he's deleted them. He finished the pages in that notebook, and by 1856 he had begun another one, but this time he more optimistically called it Books Most Certainly to be Read. Famously, he opened a series of notebooks, which we've now called the evolutionary notebooks, lettered from A to E, and then another mini-series called M and N, in which he explored evolutionary ideas. He kept another notebook for his experimental ideas and some of the results of his experiments. He kept a list of the pigeons that he was breeding. He kept a list of the barnacles that he was trying to dissect. He kept lists for everything. He ran a voluntary savings club for the labourers, the farm labourers in the village where he lived in Kent, and later expanded this into a penny savings scheme that would help participants pay for winter fuel, for which he kept the accounts and submitted to the relevant government body every year. So this compulsion to record and order data reached into all quarters of his life. His long-suffering household butler, who was called Joseph Parslow, made manila brown paper folders labeled by subject matter for his master to put slips of useful information as a homemade version of a filing cabinet. You may not be able to read this terribly well because he habitually, this is Darwin's handwriting, habitually used an orange crayon or a brown pencil to write. This says embryology, folder 12, in which he would put all his embryology notes. He made notes on the early development of his children, and these same children later helped him in compiling a shelf catalogue of his books. Even his recreations were subject to the power of the written record. Over many decades, he kept another small notebook in which he recorded the results of each game of backgammon that he played with his wife. And in a letter to Jane Grey, the wife of the Harvard botanist Asa Gray, he once wrote, "Now, the tally with my wife in backgammon stands thus. She, poor creature, has won only 2,490 games, whilst I have won, hurrah, 2,795 games. So it's not only recording, it's also competitive. And most well known in this tendency for an accounting mode of thought is the document Darwin wrote when considering the case for getting married. I'm sure many of you have come across this, but it's called at the top, it's pros and cons, left and right. Marry or not marry, this is the question. And there's a number of things that I'd like to draw your attention to here. On the not marry side, on the right, I won't read the whole of it, but you'll see it begins with no children, no second life. If he not married, he'd have freedom to go wherever he liked, choice of society, and little of it, conversation of clever men in clubs, not forced to visit relatives, and to bend in every trifle. There we are. Bend in every trifle. Have the expense and anxiety of children, perhaps quarreling, loss of time, cannot read in the evenings, fatness and idleness, anxiety and responsibility, less money for books. And on the Mary side, over here on the left, he begins making the case for the things that he's already detailed on the right. So he starts with children. That's an advantage of getting married, if it please God. He'd have a constant companion, down here, constant companion, and friend in old age, who'll feel interested in one, object to be beloved and played with. And then you'll see, he puts up here in the margins, better than a dog, anyhow. Charms of music and female chit-chat. These things good for one's health, but terrible loss of time. My God, it is intolerable to think of spending one's whole life like a new to be, working, 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 and nothing after all. No, won't do, which is in the middle here. And then down at the bottom, he says, just picture to yourself a nice, soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books and music, perhaps. Compare this with the dingy reality of Great Marlborough Street, which was where he was living in London at the time. Marry, marry, marry. QED. So there's something about all this that is interesting, and it suggests a man who worked best if the data were ordered and categorized. And I think it's not a trivial matter. I think we can see here the same language of time, productivity, and labor that we see elsewhere in the developing industrial economy of Great Britain. Perhaps the same language that his grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, used when reorganizing his factories more than 50 years previously through the division of labor. Darwin was adopting a style of living and working that emphasized the collection and comparison of data, and was also more broadly participating in the shift that then underway towards standardization and tabulation of information that underpinned the emerging Victorian way of life, increasingly dominated by railway timetables, for example, actuarial tables, population censuses, the collection of medical statistics, as well as the division of labor seen in the factories. So economy of time, to Darwin and to many of his contemporaries, was thought to be a source of wealth and knowledge. So here in these annual accounting books lies a natural economy that directly relates to Darwin's sense of himself as the head of his household. Judging from that response to Galton's questionnaire that I showed you at the beginning, he apparently came to judge himself as a husband and a father almost entirely by his ability to manage money and to provide for his growing family. By 1859, when The Origin of Species was published, he and Emma had 7 surviving children of the 10 that were born to them. Here is Darwin and his oldest son, William, on the left, and Emma Darwin, and Lenny's not the youngest son, he's the youngest by 3, but Emma Darwin and Leonard here, taken by the process of daguerreotype, which is why they're rather poor in reproduction. You know, daguerreotypes, you have to sort of move your head to catch the image because they're on engraved silver in this case, and they don't photograph very well for this kind of purpose. But they're very evocative. You'll find, with the next image as well, that the family clearly had a bulk order for these kind of plaid materials. So here is Emma on the left with her last child, Charles Waring Darwin, who died at the age of 18 months from scarlet fever. And here is Henrietta, who becomes Henrietta Litchfield in later life and writes a very interesting biography of her mother. And Annie Darwin, who died at the age of 10, who was slightly older. She's the oldest daughter. So there were 7 living children, so 7 children who lived to adulthood out of the 10. So Darwin had a lot of children to account for, to deal with, to finance. He had governesses, he had school bills, he sent the boys away to public school, which in Britain is private school, and he had a large house in the country, here, a very beautiful large house in the country, and he had a staff to manage. So accounting in this regard genuinely represents the input of a man of property that was looking after all the people and the land under his aegis. So I think these annual inspections of his resources provided some form of reassurance that he was fulfilling his role as the head of his household. And the eagerness with which he compiled the figures also suggests that proper accounting was the way by which he judged his own moral status as well, or his own virtue, we might say. Accountancy was also a form of accountability. The English historian William Ashworth describes the way that creditworthiness in science, as in business, was usually based, indeed had to be based, on a person's accuracy, probity, and self-discipline. Remember, too, that by then Darwin had no direct belief in God in his life. By the middle years of his life, he had given up most of the conventional institutions of Christianity. He didn't believe in baptism, he didn't believe in the words of the creed, he didn't wish to see his sons sign the 39 Articles, he didn't go to church. Doesn't mean to say that he rejected all the divine, any thought of the divine. He wrote that he thought, by the time he was writing The Origin of Species, that he deserved to be called a theist. So that he wasn't completely rejecting the sense of the divine, but he had no direct image or this kind of support of an active God in his life. So that good management of the family finances came to signal his sense of commitment to the moral structure of the Victorian world, that he was doing his duty, that he was a good man, that he was virtuous, that he looked after people, and that he did that through an orderly life rather than going to church, let's say. So keeping accounts was for him, as for many other Victorians, a tool for probity and self-discipline, as well as a way of becoming a virtuous member of society. Now, this is the very point that Thomas Robert Malthus made in his essay on the principle of population. Malthus had argued that sooner or later, populations, human populations, if they continue to grow in size, will be checked by famine or disease or by other kinds of illnesses, and that this situation was divinely imposed on humankind expressly to teach virtuous behavior. The profligate labouring classes, as characterized by Malthus, were accused of not only increasing endlessly in number, but also of spending any money that they had. They did not save, they did not think ahead, they lived only for the day, he wrote. By contrast, as also described by Malthus, the respectable, middling kinds of classes tended to save their money and to think ahead. These commonplace cultural assumptions rang true to Darwin and to many other members of his circle, and like most of his contemporaries, he ascribed moral virtue to those qualities. So such Malthusian political economies, of course, appeared in On the Origin of Species. They reappeared again in Darwin's Descent of Man, published 12 years later in 1871, where he explicitly declared that the accumulated wealth of the prosperous classes, and it seems to me that he was thinking of Britain here, the accumulated wealth of the prosperous classes was the key factor in the emergence of a civilized society. These are Darwin's words. A civilized society, he said, was one that emphasized the rule of natural economic law, the balance between those who labor to make wealth and those who spend it, in a more or less harmonious design carrying moral significance and cultural advantage for nations. And this is a quote from The Descent of Man. He said, "The presence of a body of well-instructed men who have not to labor for their daily bread is important to a degree which cannot be overestimated, as all high intellectual work is carried on by them, and on such work material progress of all kinds mainly depends, not to mention other and higher advantages." So I'm wanting to say here that the natural theological framework of Malthus's writings was brought by Darwin into his theories of evolution by natural selection. We know this, it's not contested, but I'm proposing here that it was also, Malthus meant something to Darwin in terms of the moral value of looking after his money and looking after his family. So we could almost say that Malthus's writings were secularized, the natural theology was taken out by Darwin, but nevertheless was important in the way Darwin thought about his home life and his scientific work. And turning now to the role of money as metaphor, I want to propose also that Darwin's account books, or his accounting frame of mind, might equally have been seen by him as an aid to conceptualizing animal and plant evolution. I want to stress that there's no evidence at all to suggest that his account books were causal in generating his theory of evolution by natural selection. The chronology doesn't fit, and we know far too much about the way Darwin came to think about evolutionary theory and then formulated the idea of natural selection. We know that it wasn't his account books that did that for him. All I'm trying to say is that there was metaphors that are sort of useful to him in his middle life when he was those long years spent justifying and verifying the astonishing power of natural selection theory. So under this point of view, where money serves as a metaphor for natural selection, an animal or plant might be regarded metaphorically as possessing debits and credits in the natural economy, where each favorable adaptation might add to an organism's individual capital, each profitable adaptation leading to a consolidation of market share. This is exactly what he was doing and seeing in his investment books. And the metaphor's not completely fanciful. The word species in evolutionary biology, after all, derives from the old financial term specie for money, for coinage. The language of accountancy is intended to make objective, generalized statements out of many individualized transactions. And perhaps these activities of real money, carried out over a long period of time with such regularity, could have provided Darwin with a way to visualize the probability of a small number of favorable variations maintaining their place in a larger population sufficiently long enough to invest their biological capital until a stage was reached where profits could be reaped and dividends distributed. Such symbolic capital could be composed of adaptive traits, and like monetary capital, could perhaps be converted into all kinds of resources necessary for activity and profitability. So Darwin's view of nature emphasized, as we all know, the acquisition and retention of advantages. Here, in a nutshell, is the central theme of natural selection. Nature could perhaps, however, also be seen as a monetary economy, just as easily as it was regarded as a political economy. So I'm coming to a conclusion now. More than 40 years ago, the English historian Robert Young argued that Darwin's system of biological change was deeply interconnected with 19th century economic thought. This isn't news to us. However, it was a provocative claim back in the 1960s, calling on a special blend of Marxism and Cambridge University intellectual history that required converts to adopt what Young called the common context, in which the leading ideas of science, literature, theology, philosophy, and economic theory circulated freely amongst the elite. Such claims would hardly be contested today. Everything we now know about the structure and language of evolution by natural selection indicates that Darwin drew on Malthus's essay of the principle of population. That text provided Darwin with the central ideas of competition, struggle, and survival, and over the space of a few days in September 1837, helped him construct his mechanism of natural selection. So we know Malthus was important for Darwin. That text was also important for Alfred Russel Wallace, the other man in the evolutionary story, and provided Wallace with his central ideas of competition, struggle, and survival. And this mutual reliance on Malthus was surely one of the most astonishing features of the simultaneous yet independent formulation of the concept of evolution by natural selection by both Darwin and Wallace in the middle years of the century. And the mutual reliance on Malthus was surely also an important component, a major element in the shock that Darwin felt on receiving Wallace's letter in 1858 that indicated that Wallace had a theory of evolution by natural selection. So since Robert Young's time, we've become accustomed to see Darwin as a member of the elite manufacturing classes, familiar with commercial concerns, well-versed in the entrepreneurial ethos of an expanding imperial marketplace for British goods, subscribing to liberal reformist agendas, and adopting all the values of the new industrial society, including what Perkins has called the middle classes' transition into paper wealth. So it's probably no surprise to see him endorsing the accumulation of financial assets and endowing the process with a civilizing moral status as he did in The Descent of Man. These sentiments evidently had a real meaning for him as a member of the moneyed classes. To him, I'm making a bold claim here, to him, the acquisition and preservation of capital was clearly a worthy and moral endeavor. His private life and his scientific life merged together here in this idea of virtue, as expressed by financial probity and the keeping of accounts that he mentioned in his response to Galton. So many historians have attended to record keeping as a significant factor in the process of manufacturing power and knowledge. The establishment of a numerical paper record is seen as a key stage in systematizing and analyzing otherwise unintelligible entities. All nation states have needed the authority of numbers to control, to understand. If we want to be Foucauldian about it, if we want to follow the works of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, we could say that the numbers were also used to confine a population in various ways. And keeping accounts has long been recognized as a pivotal element in the emergence of capitalism and the rise of bureaucracies alongside of modernity. And further than this, there are real theological echoes, ancient theological echoes in bookkeeping practices that speak of entering moral credits and debits into the ledgers of life, of divine judgment, of being called to account on the day, the final day. And although we don't have time to go into the history of accountancy, you'll know that it's Babylonian in origin at root, very early at root, and was naturalized by the Catholic and Protestant traditions. Keeping accounts was part of a more general rhetoric of orderliness that came to a peak in the industrialized England of the 19th century. The vocabulary of efficiency, as colleagues of mine, Ted Porter, Rainey Daston, Susan Fay Cannon, and others describe it, the vocabulary of efficiency was then elevated by the Victorians into a distinctive voice of the times, a voice that was simultaneously moral, scientific, and numerical. So I'm suggesting today, the first of my 3 talks, that there's a great deal of virtue in this sense of a moral economy, and it's virtue that I shall be moving onwards with in the next 2 talks. Darwin's economy of nature can be seen as a moral economy and as an economy of the household. And I've tried to argue today that this trio of economies were aspects of a single, deeply rooted element in his character, that of making lists. Darwin's commitment to keeping accounts surely helped him make his daily life into an enterprise that he believed was virtuous, that crystallized everything he understood about life in the intellectual, prosperous classes of mid-Victorian Britain. So directly and indirectly, I think this practice lay at the heart of his great project to understand evolution by natural selection and his amazing book, his fundamentally distinctive book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Thank you very much. Well, you've touched on a terrifically important point. For those people who work on Darwin manuscripts, we have no idea how much he meant us to read what he wrote. So those notes on marriage, I think, were intended to be private. He had written some earlier ones a month or 2 beforehand that are often also used in scholarship. These marriage notes are very frequently now read aloud at marriage services. You may have come across that. It's very charming. or at least the bit about the dog is often the bit that's read aloud, and the nice soft wife on the sofa. So I think they were meant to be private. They were kept, and we know that he showed them to his wife-to-be, because there's some jokes about the notes in some of her letters. And we know that either she or Darwin himself showed those notes on marriage to his daughter, who got married. And as far as I understand it, they remained private until the Darwin papers came to the Cambridge University Library in the 1950s, because for many, many years, many decades, I'm going to talk about it on Thursday, manuscripts were not really part of what people needed to know about Darwin. The private life was not the scientific life. The scientific life was thought to be an important achievement. So, as I understand it, the answer to your quick answer to your question is that no, they weren't meant to be seen. But then shyly, we imagine, a romantic moment, he said to his wife-to-be, you know, I did work this all out, and here you are. Yeah,
thank you. Oh, thank you very much. There seems to be an obvious connection between this predilection to list making and ordering and so forth, and taxonomies and that sort of thing. I remember from my early work life how much I enjoyed doing performance analyses in business, and I often like to think that there's a connection between that and my enjoyment of science. And so I wonder if you are able to see something like a connection or a conjecture about the fact that he's very involved in investment, and he's coming up with causal theories later.
Yes. Thank you. So you're, I hope, a convert to this suggestion I'm making, that they're tightly interwoven. So we know that Darwin really enjoyed his investment. He liked to follow his investments. I don't suppose the Times newspaper in those days had a page of share prices like they used to in the most recent decades, but he would turn to the business pages of the newspaper before the other pages. So he enjoyed his investments, he thought he was good at it, he enjoyed a little speculation occasionally, but he was never taking risks. The interrelation of running they didn't have things like spreadsheets, so he couldn't have run a projection. But he asked his knowledgeable acquaintances how they thought such and such a railroad company would pan out. He was very interested in the Philadelphia docks, and he wrote to somebody in the States to ask him, were they really as successful as was being reported in Britain? He would write to his brother to say, what do you think about X or Y for Emma's trust fund? So there's a lot of engagement here. I'm not sure if that's really answering your question, but I think we could confidently look at Darwin as a person in Victorian England engaging in investment with the accounts to back it up. We don't have to necessarily study him as an evolutionist. There's a lot of material that would just add to our understanding of finance in the 19th century.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I believe we now understand that Darwin abhorred slavery and spoke out against it. So I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of, and it was probably quite common amongst his group, his social group in Victorian England, to feel quite happy with themselves and their moral status and all the rest. But all around them, we know, of course, there was great suffering in Victorian England and throughout the empire. And, you know, of course, I'm thinking also of the famine in Ireland. Did Darwin ever comment either in writing or as far to other in letters about the plight of the poor, other than from some Malthusian thing, which sounds terribly hard-hearted for my hero, but that he, that basically if people behave like that, that's what they got. And I'm sure he didn't think it was divine providence because he had dispensed with that theory. But is there anything in his writings or his letters to that effect? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really tough and interesting question to follow through. So we do know that Darwin had tremendous distaste for slavery, but we also know that that didn't stop him investing in cotton manufacturers or the sugar trade or some of the other things that came with the plantation economy of Britain at the time. He perhaps was able to separate these two, but his moral sense of every individual was the same. We were all brothers and sisters under the skin was very pronounced. So his social views and his kind of investment views were not fully integrated with his humane views, his sense of humanity. And if you read the Desmond and Moore book about slavery, Darwin's vision of Darwin's anti-slavery beliefs and those of his family, you'll see that they're very astute about that disconnect. Whether that's something that many people of Darwin's social class had, I'm unable to say, but for Darwin himself, he was fully respectable, prosperous. He believed in accumulating wealth in order to advance the arts and civilization, to look after his own family, and he understood that much of that was based on interest rates, drawing on farmers who perhaps aren't able to supply that money, drawing on laborers. He didn't invest in Ireland, and we know that he thought that the famine was terrible, and he followed some of the accounts of the emigration. We know he followed the ebb and flow of the Civil War with great passion, that he was very much for the North, for abolishing slavery. But there's a disconnect. And you've put your finger on it. It's just sort of hard to connect those two bits together. There was a gentleman in the back? Yes. You're going to have to shout.
Wasn't it usual for the head of a large household with many staff members and children and, in fact, multiple households to keep accounts of this sort? In other words, were these records of Darwin's unusual in some way for the time?
Thank you. They are unusual in that they've been kept, that they're available. And that's because Darwin was famous. So there must be many, many accounts that were kept that just got lost. Yes, there's a very substantial number of household accounts that are made available through the British Library and other places. I would imagine that's similar in the United States and other places. It's just that they're usually, in Britain, if you'll forgive me, they're usually connected with the aristocracy. The big estates always had factors, people who did the accounts, so that the accounts of the big estates are really quite well known and very copious from the 16th century to the 19th century. Something like Darwin's household accounts are not so usual to find. And here we've got a terrific, thorough, complete record from 1839 to 1882. It's astonishing. Every toothbrush we have, and I know where he bought his toothbrushes, every merino wool, what the British call vests, underwear, we know where he bought that. We know the price. It's an amazing resource. So it is unusual, I think, that we have that in so much detail. something you didn't mention but is very relevant is that it's mostly men who make these accounts. So Emma Darwin had her own accounts for the household that we know her husband required her to do because she was a bit, she didn't really feel the need to do that, but he wanted to know how much the meat cost, the candles cost, how many pigs were bought, and he totaled up Emma's accounts at the end of the year and put them into his accounts. And if I had been writing a more gendered description of this, I would have made the point that, in fact, Darwin was sort of appropriating the financial details that Emma had been in charge of. So she had a cash book, she had income that he gave her, that she spent, but then he wanted to know how she'd spent it. So I leave that to you. Thank you, that's a helpful question.
I seem to remember from some years ago an absolutely delightful and personable display at the Museum of Natural History in New York about Darwin. And if I remember correctly, part of the end of that was a letter written by his wife expressing her pure happiness in his character, partly because he loved animals. And I wondered whether we had anything much that she had written that might cast light on her attitude toward his accounting, especially as apparently hers was kind of co-opted into it.
Yes, I can only recall of one at the moment, which I'll mention in just half a second. His son, Francis, who wrote the introductory chapters to Darwin's Life and Letters after his death. The son, Francis, says that he recalls how anxious his father would get if he wasn't able to record expenditure in his cash book, and that he would fidget and reach for his cash book and wasn't settled until he had written in the sixpence for the toothbrush. And we know that Emma Darwin, probably for many, many things, she had, and I'm going to be sentimental here, she had a very affectionate kind of non-committal view of her husband. And she wrote to one of the daughters to say, your father's been doing his annual accounts again. We're all in penury. We were all in penury until he discovered a page where he had miscalculated, and so everything's fine again. And so, yes, of course, it was a very prevalent part of the household. We don't live with them, but we could perhaps imagine that this was a very regular part of his daily life. Thank you.
Janet, you mentioned Galton early on. He was well known for a passion for counting.
Yes.
Whenever you can, count, he said. Do you see any connection between his propensity for counting and Darwin's? I don't mean genetic, but I mean by way of example.
By way of family training, the two cousins could well have had that same sense of needing to know things in numbers rather than airy-fairy kinds of more abstract things. So one of Darwin's big characteristics, and I've gone on about it a lot this afternoon, was that he really liked to know things in numerical form, but without being a mathematician or a statistician or a calculator in the sense that his cousin Francis Galton was, who really, I mean, that would be a talk. He was really compulsive about making his whole experience with the world, be turning that into numbers. Dan has written about Galton very wonderfully, the sense that a human physique could be turned into statistical tables, the proportion between the hand and the elbow and the shoulder. So the anthropometric devices that Galton invented in order to do this. He invents so many of the statistical techniques that we use today, the regression and various kinds of correlations. The next generation after Francis Galton were deeply engaged in what they called biometrics, the measurement of evolutionary trends. So the two of them are very much the same, but we could perhaps include a whole bunch of other scientists who were equally engaged with numbers that weren't Galton or Darwin. So I'm sure they're learning the technique of double-entry bookkeeping. You have to learn that. It doesn't come naturally. And that's a family practice that they learned, both of them. I mean, I don't want to sound genetic about this, but yes, there was a family tendency to record things. Yes. They were not only, they were obsessive. Okay, so let's examine that. Is obsession a family characteristic? Well, I know this is being recorded, but I would say yes. Yes. Thank you. Perhaps we'll change that. Commitment, I think, yes.
Hello. I've been under the impression that Darwin kept a very short work day. Were they just thinking of his doing science and writing science and not thinking of his managing the household? Did he really have a lot longer day than we give him credit for, or some quarters give him credit for?
What an interesting question. Thank you. So he was in action all the day. And when he said in his reminiscences that he only worked for a couple of hours a day, he meant hard thinking, writing work. The rest of the day was maximized to be effective doing other things, like he would be reading, or he'd be doing correspondence, or he'd be doing his accounts, or he'd be taking a walk and thinking, or he would be having a rest. So the day was a long day, no longer than a normal day, but a long day. And like most of us, he learnt how to maximize and be most effective, that he did his heavy-duty working early in the morning. Then he would have a late breakfast. Then he would do something else, and so on and so on. So the work filled the day. But the writing work, the books that he was doing, were really only a couple of hours a day.
I think Professor Browne has had a long day today, so we'll let her finish now. And I'll invite you all to join us for a reception at the other end of the hall in this building right after we exit this room. Thank you. And watch this space for more Darwin.
Thank you.